have a very strong tendency to reason about information, and they are comparative and observant of information in the environment and are highly sensitive to information and its relation to things in which they already know, and are very much interested in mining and analyzing what it is that they receive from the environment and in associating it with things that they understand and being concerned with what they don't understand. Necessarily, I think that this is a very prominent underlying factor of intelligence. And one can say whatever it is they wish to say about IQ tests, but it has been demonstrated that when one tests the executive functions and give individuals what they call executive function batteries, which are tests that load the prefrontal region of the frontal region of the brain and the executive functions, the ones that govern our ability to focus, have very strong linear lines of thought to create chains of reasoning and stringent schematizations and thinking of future implications to things and abstracting and manipulating mental objects and representations and making abstractions out of information that's within the environment. Anytime that an individual is given these sort of tests and they see how well they perform in these tests, they have a very strong positive correlation with one's IQ score. You will not do well on these tests if you don't do well on cognitive executive function tests. It's to say that it does not matter really so many of the other things that people ascribe to IQ. IQ misses this, IQ misses that. IQ doesn't consider social ability. IQ doesn't consider many other abilities that we hold salient and important to our ability to be successful in the environment. And my quip to that and my rebuttal is that's not the point of IQ. IQ was invented and conceived to test for mental deficiencies first, and then was adapted to be a measure of mental aptitude and ability. And people have their differences of opinions and whether or not it has its place in being a test for aptitude, a strict test for aptitude and abilities. But what it is able to detect without fault is deficiencies in executive functioning. And that is very much what the backbone of many what is the backbone of STEM-related fields. It is the backbone of the systematization of knowledge in fields in domains of knowledge. That is really the mode of thought, and that people hate that there is a bias for this necessarily, but you would not get many of the things that lead to technological innovation. You would not get the enormous boom and proliferation of scientific understanding and inquiry that has prolonged life and given a great deal of capital gain and continuation of healthy existence and the opportunity for more and more life despite natural limitations and barriers that affront us by way of nature, germs, and many other factors and elements. It is that we do not like the fact that there may be irreconcilable differences in people, really, but we do always run to and accept the fruits of a very real type of thinking that intelligence tests or IQ tests select for and only exclusively select for, but yet and still will villainize it when we do not find ourselves under the curtain of its appraisal. And that, to me, is completely contradictory and hypocritical, but people aren't completely rational. So I suppose I should not be surprised by this, but it is to say that the strength of one's executive functions are the prime focus of IQ tests. That is, to me, that is without question what they are here for. And they're very much more so concerned with sniffing out the deficiencies in one's ability to use executive functions than to necessarily tell the tale of one's profundancy with said functioning in the brain. But one's working memory, fluid intelligence, quantitative reasoning, verbal reasoning, and general crystallized intelligence or overall body of knowledge does have a strong pervasive factor in their ability to get along in any other field. I find as a physics major, when I take other classes, they are relatively easy for me. They're not hard. They do not have the same load per se. When I take classes that do not have the same load on abstract reasoning or executive functioning and working memory, essentially, it's just not the same thing. And there is a very real pattern within the fields and within STEM subjects to be stringent, particularly within the hard sciences, and in things like cognitive science, neuroscience, psychometricians, theoretical biologists, chemical engineers, mathematicians, physicists, statisticians, algorithmists, computer engineers. You find you can pill any one of those fields whenever they load heavily on they all load heavily on one's executive functioning and really one's ability to deal with abstraction and heavy computational reasoning. You don't find people in that field with IQs less than 120. And you find in certain tests, well, at least in certain studies, that some even purport that in the fields have a threshold of 120 and an average of 130. And that is to say that the reason that people may find that IQ does not necessarily tell us much about one's ability to be socially ingratiating, gregarious, affable, and charismatic, or harmonious, or necessarily agreeable, is because the test was not conceived to be that in the first place. So who really cares? We have had for years a expression for being able to make the right decisions and to be sort of socially astute in some ways, and people have called this wisdom. I do not know where it adds to anything to create a whole separate or special intelligence for it called emotional or social intelligence. I don't think that that's even a thing. I think that there is a fundamental tenet to human beings to be social in nature, per se, and that one can really very much develop a sort of social handbook and skill, even if they are completely not as inherently strong as these things, such as myself, and get by fine in the world without having to be necessarily Martha Stewart or Oprah Winfrey. Um, I don't think that those individuals count as highly intelligent in a certain way, but are mostly human or highly human in one way. It's to say also that in terms of um, uh, what is the other one that is talked about? There are very real things in terms of multiple intelligences too, to where I don't see how they differ from skills or talents, or generally talents and aptitudes, and it's that there is embodied traits that do definitely influence one's ability to be within a field or a domain of knowledge better than others. One could say intelligence is that, but the problem is just that generally one's ability to reason about things, or simply to say 1 plus 1 equals 2, or 2 plus 2 equals 4, to connect bits of information and make lines and chains of reasoning and rationally centric narratives out of things is going to be so beneficial within any field, really. I do not find, even as myself when I was younger in drawing and being an artist, that I thought about art the same way that others thought about art, and to where I very much systematized what I did, and was so concerned with realism more so than my own self-expression, and what I was able to create in terms of artwork was very profound for an 8 and a 9-year-old, and it was because of the way I thought about things. I hate to be self-referential in this, but there are fairly many examples, particularly within the Renaissance, insofar as the academies and schools for artists, and that there is a craft and a science to it, that even in that time, pre-Enlightenment period, that there was an idea to the systematization of things, and very really that's a prominent factor in all systems of philosophy, and that it even pervaded moral philosophy and thought really up until very recent years and post-romantic period. And I hate romanticism, quite honestly, as a thinker, but it is to say that the function of the role that the executive functions play, and how much it underpins and colors and pervades so many different aspects and factors of life, is for me too obvious and too invasive and dispersive across many resolutions of analyses. I cannot determine what will necessarily, how the question of intelligence is going to play out, but I can tell one this, that IQ is not perfect, but it is the best thing that we have come up with up to date, though that there are certainly problems with it. But I would say that the arguments against it are not very good, insofar as this, that IQ has too much too much correlation with what we know about the hereditary factors of intelligence, and has greater predictive power than anything else we've come up with to date. Also, there is too strong of a physiological palette of evidence and framework for why, in terms of an explanatory framework for why IQ is what it is, and why certain people appear the way that they do, and why certain groups like autistic individuals do well in certain fields, because they tend to have a very strong executive networks, and a greater prominence and leaning towards working memory. And IQ tests very much select for these things. There is too much that it can explain without it having too many moving parts and details for any serious researcher to want to reject something, for it has far too much promise, despite so much of the popular bastardization it has had in things like the bell curve, or eugenics, or the misuse in terms of educational theory, and the complete disavowal and undermining of certain groups. It's not that any of these things have anything, that any of these events necessarily have anything to do with the strength of IQ as a predictive scientific theory, and something that does have empirical evidence behind it, backing it up, and empirical evidence that is genetically based, physiologically based, and physiologically based. That is too strong of a palette per se for one to just so quickly throw it out and give it up. And it just does not seem in analyses that when we cannot give animals IQ tests, but interestingly enough, we can give them nonverbal batteries. And for the quips about IQ tests that they are verbally biased, there are plenty of ways to give people IQ tests that do not have verbal loads on them, that will strictly test their fluid intelligence, their working memory, and their ability for quantitative and spatial reasoning. And those are the two, those are really the strongest factors that one is trying to select for, because one is really only trying to select for individuals that have high executive functioning, that will will be better suited for higher abstract loading. And that's it. That's all that they're concerned with. It's inhumane in this way that you do not care if a racehorse necessarily is friendly to other horses. You only care about how fast it can run. That's it. That's the IQ tests are an appraisal of cognitive deficiency, and they are an appraisal of they tend to be consequentially an appraisal of one's executive functions, and that is the only use that it has. But it is a very salient and linchpinning sort of factor in many aspects of life, and has strange predictive capacities to it. Multiple intelligence does not even have nearly the same kind of quantification behind it. There really aren't very good studies, and no study done on multiple intelligence to take it from the trait dichotomy to the ability dichotomy has been one successful in showing that there is no such thing as general intelligences, and that general intelligences doesn't explain for the phenomenon of multiple intelligence. That just has not been shown by anyone, and there is no researcher to date who takes this theory seriously in terms of its empirical basis and predictive capacities. And it is to say that multiple intelligences is not a good theory, and I think that whatever apprehensions and distaste and consternation that individuals have for IQ as it presently stands is that it is an affront to their own belief of self-efficacy or their own belief of cognitive efficacy, and that very really in the egalitarian age, it is the final thing that stands as a real, it is one of the very prominent, as well as differences in sex differences in the brain, that these are two of the last final prominent components that do pose irreconcilable and irreducible differences between people, to where we cannot hold the notion that all people are essentially the same. But I have argued in other videos that I do not know why all people have to be the same for all of us to be treated fairly and equally. Those are my thoughts on multiple intelligences, and I think that this will be my final argument and discussion of the topic. And I'm waiting for the dislikes and the angry messages and contentious argumentative comments to roll in at this point. So that's my video. Hopefully you found it interesting, and thank you for watching.